Hi, this is Stuart Nachbar with Educated Quest. Today we're going to learn about a different kind of school where your education is taught from great books written by great thinkers of centuries ago. And that is your whole education. You don't graduate with a major like you do at most other colleges. Today, I'm with Benjamin Baum, the Vice President for Enrollment Management at St. John's College in two places, Annapolis, Maryland, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. The campus in Annapolis is the third oldest college in the United States of America. Obviously, the campus in Santa Fe is much newer. New Mexico was not a state during the 18th or 19th century. But this is an unusual place to go to school, but it has a model that has been proven well since 1937. Ben, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Ben, what makes St. John's in Annapolis and Santa Fe stand out from other schools?
It's the curriculum. It's a curriculum that you won't find really anywhere else in the world. As you mentioned, St. John's goes back to 1696, but we adopted this curriculum in 1937. And it is what we call a great books curriculum. All of our students are doing this shared experience together. They're reading great books starting from the ancient world, reading Plato and Homer, Euclid, and reading their way through modern authors by the time they're a senior. And so the whole curriculum is premised on reading these great books and then coming to class, and every single class being a discussion, 20 students or fewer, talking about the books. And the books cut across every discipline you can imagine. People often hear books and they assume literature, and that's true, there's a lot of literature, but it's literature, it's philosophy, it's actually math, it's science, it's language, it's music. The idea is, though, that we return to the original author's ideas in all of these subjects. And our students, as a result, graduate with a Bachelor of Arts in Liberal Arts, having studied just about everything over the course of 4 years through the great books and through these discussions in the classroom.
Now, the people who teach these classes, they're a little different than your typical professor giving a talk. Is it more like a facilitated discussion and the professor guides the students through it?
It is, and often many students come to us having been in high school environments where they were exposed to discussion-based curricula, and yet they come to St. John's and they say, wow, this is different than what I expected. And that's on purpose. We don't call our faculty professors. The idea of a professor is they profess that they're lecturing in some way. Instead, we call our faculty tutors, because really their job is to facilitate that discussion in the classroom. A great classroom at St. John's will involve the tutor asking an opening question about the text, perhaps asking a few other questions as the conversation continues, but really seeding the whole voice of the classroom to the students themselves. And students tend to direct the conversation themselves. They're actually having a genuine conversation with each other, a genuinely excited conversation with each other, because they're there to learn from each other from the book, not just from a lecture from a professor.
Now, how many tutors will a St. John's student have in a given semester?
You'll have in your freshman year, for example, you take 5 classes. And so freshman year, you take a, what we call our classes tutorials in many cases. You take a math tutorial, you take a science laboratory and tutorial, you take a music tutorial, you will take a language tutorial where freshman year, everyone studies ancient Greek, and then you'll have seminar, where in seminar, we put together all of the great texts of the humanities and the social sciences. Seminar tends to be the heart of what we do. And in each of those first 4 classes, you have one tutor in the classroom. And so there'll be usually around 15 students around a table with one tutor. In seminar, you might have as many as 19, 20 students, but in fact, in seminar, you have 2 tutors in the classroom. So there's no single expert around the table. You have 2 tutors who are there to help guide the conversation.
And you might have different classmates in each of those tutorials or
Yeah,
seminar?
Every student has a core group of a small group of students who will move between each of those classes. So there's always a few people you'll know between all of your classes, but the majority of people will be new in each classroom you enter.
So there's no science to match students to a tutor.
No, in fact, we deliberately want to shake things up. And so over the course of 4 years, you're going to meet many, many tutors. You may have a few who repeat themselves, but you can go through 4 years, in fact, with having very few or no tutors, in fact, repeat themselves.
So how many freshmen typically take on this experience on each campus?
We have on the Annapolis campus, typically about 150 or so freshmen. And on the Santa Fe campus, usually close to 125 freshmen. And so deliberately really small freshman classes designed so that we can keep the classroom experience really small, but also so it's a genuine community where people know each other and care about each other. And in fact, the reason why we have a Santa Fe campus, which was founded in 1964, was because we decided that we didn't want to just grow the size of St. John's, the footprint in Annapolis. We wanted to maintain the kind of community we had always had in Annapolis and just transplant it to a new location. And so that's what we did in 1964 when we founded Santa Fe.
So these students, so there's a small group of students, and they're all in small sessions. Do they tend to, two questions here. One, do they tend to talk to each other? Oh, my tutor is, or my tutor is wow. Or, do they tend to talk to each other?
Yeah, so I mean, you will know, I mean, in a freshman class of 140, 150 students, you know everyone. And so, and you're also reading the same text together. You may be in separate classes. You may have different tutors in your classes, but in fact, everyone is reading, Homer's Iliad, the first text you read in seminar at the same time. So if you go to the dining hall and sit next to someone who's not in your seminar, but is in a different seminar, but they're a freshman, they'll also be reading the Iliad, and you can have a fascinating conversation with them about what's happening in their seminar classroom that's not happening in yours. And because these conversations are directed by the students themselves, you can end up having really different conversations in different classrooms about the same text, depending upon the people who are there. And then this is one of the reasons why you see the conversation that happens in the classroom spill outside of the classroom all the time. We share the texts in common. And so you could be in the dining hall, you could be in the dorms, you could be on a sports field, and people are talking about ancient Greek authors freshman year and how their class's perspective might be really different from someone else's class's perspective.
Well, suppose you and I were students together at St. John's, and you have one tutor, I have another, and I come to you and I say, "Oh, Ben, my tutor, she doesn't like me very much, and I know you're always saying really nice things about yours. Can I switch into your class?"
Generally not, at least not in that semester. And so, I mean, of course, there are serious reasons why students might need to switch classes over the course of a semester or a year. But typically, students are in that same class for at least that semester, and often actually for the full year before shifting over to a new tutor in a particular class.
Now, for math, there's been computer programming, and for science, there's labs. If you're working in original text versus like a physics textbook at a traditional college, how do you teach math? How do you run a lab or use a computer to do calculations or things like that?
So we don't use textbooks. So it involves going to the original author who came up with some of these foundational ideas of our civilization, effectively, going back as far as people like Ptolemy when studying astronomy freshman year, and coming as recently as people like Einstein, perhaps senior year, but going to their original writings and having a discussion in the classroom about the ideas that are being shared here, and then recreating their work in our laboratories. And so, so proving, in fact, the things that they described are actually replicable, proving things that may not have been true. One of the most fascinating experiences in the sciences we have here is starting in the ancient Greek world, learning about how the Earth how the sun must revolve around the Earth. And we look at the math and we look at the science from the ancient Greek world, and it seems correct. It seems true that, in fact, it must be that the sun revolves around the earth. And of course, we know that's not true, but it's not until you follow this intellectual tradition over the course of a few more centuries that we develop these new tools using math and science to reassess those original assumptions we made that were in fact wrong. And so in some ways, our students are following the kind of great thoughts that happened over the course of centuries from these thinkers who eventually arrived at the right conclusions. But it took a collective effort of these great authors speaking to each other to arrive at those answers.
You bring up an interesting point. Does the tutor ever have to remind people to think in the context of those times?
It can depend on the circumstances. Generally, we're not trying to have a conversation about history when we're talking about really any of these subjects. And so we aren't necessarily studying what happened in that moment. We're studying the ideas themselves, and those ideas in some ways transcend the times. We've selected the books that we read mostly because they deal with these big questions of human existence, whether they're philosophical questions or scientific questions, but they're questions that are still relevant today, even though they were originally asked perhaps hundreds or thousands of years ago. And so we generally try to avoid that question of how do we understand this in the time, because we want to ask ourselves, how are these questions still relevant to us today?
Over time from 1937 to now, has the faculty ever had to consider which works, were part of the curriculum, and did they ever, because people come up with new ideas. I mean, a lot of Einstein's work was not known in 1937.
Yep.
How do does the faculty often discuss, we should include this or this, and maybe this has become less important, less relevant?
All the time. And so we make amendments to the reading list every year, sometimes very small ones, sometimes bigger ones. Just recently in the last few years, we've included not the most modern works, not things that we're reading today, but things that weren't included in 1937, like Simone de Beauvoir. She was recently added to the curriculum. We've recently added James Baldwin. Toni Morrison is someone we're reading that wasn't obviously read in 1937 and is being read today. And so these are really careful decisions the faculty makes. They talk about these every year. The curriculum is packed. St. John's is hard. There's a lot to read. And so anything we add, we have to take something out. And so we have these really spirited discussions about who can we remove to add someone else's viewpoint who is so essential now. And so those are tweaks you can expect, going forward, every year or 2 years.
How do you find a freshman class, given the kind of reading that they're going to be expected to do, the amount of writing that they're going to be expected to do? Not everyone gets the exposure to, I mean, I could see kids in high school reading Toni Morrison or James Baldwin. I could see that today. But I don't think of people reading Euclid. I know English teachers did teach Homer in the Odyssey, but I can't, there's other works I couldn't see that your typical high school English teacher in the public school I went to in central New Jersey would put in front of a high school student. How do you find your students?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, St. John's is very self-selecting. I mean, we offer this one curriculum, and we may not be a fit for every student. And I think in some ways we have to embrace that idea that St. John's isn't necessarily a college for everyone. It's for people who are genuinely excited about what we do. And so that's the way I approach this. I try to reach out to find students who may or may not know it yet, but would be really excited to immerse themselves in these texts and these discussions the way we do it. And so, for instance, we try to feature our authors in nearly every communication we send. We have a great email campaign we send to students, prospective students, where it isn't an email from St. John's College admissions, it's an email that comes from Jane Austen, or an email that comes from Plato. And those emails then ask questions that are the kinds of questions we debate about the works written by Plato and written by Jane Austen. And so that's one technique we use. Another great one is, I know colleges these days send a lot of materials in the mail to prospective students. We too send a lot of materials, but we try to cater our materials to really pull at the heartstrings of students who are the right fit for St. John's. So we'll send actual books in the mail. Our prospective students receive Plato's Meno, one of Plato's dialogues. We send all of our admitted students Homer's Iliad. And so it's through kind of these tools that we try to reach a broad group of students, but we really try to stay true to what St. John's is all about and get students excited for what we do so well.
Now, St. John's has been test optional for a while.
I recently tried doing some research into this, and as far as I can tell, we have been test optional since 1979.
Okay, so you can't be buying the list from the College Board.
Oh, so in terms of practically where we get names, we do buy some lists from the College Board. I mean, many students are applying to colleges that do require test scores, and so we will buy names from the College Board and from the ACT. There are other sources of names that aren't test dependent, so we'll buy names from there. We do a lot of advertising through a number of different venues. Many high school systems for like Naviance. And so, it's really, there isn't one silver bullet for St. John's to reach all the right students. We really have to pull together a whole lot of resources from a lot of different places and then speak about what we do. And so a little bit of our work is a needle in the haystack, is trying to find that student, the one student at one high school or the one student at another high school who is really a great fit for us. And otherwise we might have struggled to find them.
Do you do outreach to educators like school teachers to help you in that marketing effort?
We do. In fact, St. John's produces a lot of school teachers. And so one way we do this is by reaching out to our own alumni to encourage them. We do a lot of high school visits all around the world, not just in the United States, in fact. And so there we try to put ourselves in front of students by talking with counselors in particular and telling them about St. John's, like what I'm doing today, so that they think of those students who might think like a Johnny and would be a good fit for us. So we're able to talk with them. We also have a graduate program. And so in our graduate program, we have a few different degree options, but they're based on what we do as an undergraduate program. And so they're about reading great books and having small discussions about them. And these are particularly attractive programs for teachers. In fact, we have one component of this, which is a pedagogy component that allows teachers to do a certificate in just 2 semesters. And so we have a lot of teachers who come through our graduate program and then get excited about what we do and go back to their schools and then find us those students who are going to be such a great fit.
When families come to campus, whether it's in response to a piece of marketing material or a teacher or a school counselor telling them about St. John's, when they come to campus, do you ever get the usual questions parents ask? Will my son or daughter get a job after this? Will they be able to get into medical school after this, law school? Will they? Do you get those questions?
Absolutely. We get a range of questions probably beyond what you find a typical college admissions officer has to answer. So we answer all those typical questions. What am I going to do? What dorm am I going to live in? What's the food like? And then we get questions like, how do you reconcile reading the Bible and reading Nietzsche? We have these really profound, interesting conversations about philosophy, about great books, about authors, about history. At the same time, we're talking about the food and sports and dorm rooms and laundry. And that's one of the, I think, fun things actually about working for a place like St. John's is to have these really deeply intellectual conversations with prospective students and parents and have such a distinct thing to offer, in addition to all of the kind of typical college questions that we get asked about all the time.
Do you find there's generations that have gone to St. John's since you've worked there, where the mother and father went and now the children are coming?
Yeah, absolutely. And in a given year, we typically have about 10-15% of the freshman class have someone in their family who had gone to St. John's in the past. And so that's a sizable number.
That's high.
is a kind of a one big way that people hear about us. But it's certainly a minority, the number of people who have that family history. But you will find families that have sent, several generations to St. John's, and then within those generations, in fact, brothers and sisters. And so there are some storied St. John's families out there.
Geographically, you get people from everywhere, I would guess.
We do. And so there's certainly on the Annapolis campus, there's a plurality from Maryland and Virginia and Pennsylvania. On our Santa Fe campus, there's a plurality that comes from places like New Mexico and Colorado, and also heavily California. But really both campuses draw from virtually every state in the country. And then in recent years, typically 15, maybe as much as 20% of our student body have come from overseas. And so we have a really sizable international constituency as well. And
has that grown in recent years?
It has. I mean, probably peaked a few years ago around that kind of 25% mark in maybe some freshman classes, but really has stabilized more recently around kind of 15%. And I think part of that are, I think fluctuations we all know going on with the international admissions right now. That's been very challenging for lots of places. And for us, I mean, we care so much about having real diverse perspectives in our classrooms. I mean, since every class is a discussion, the only way to really have a great conversation in the classroom is to have people who actually have different sets of life experiences, different ideas about these books. And our international students have been a huge piece of what brings that fresh perspective into the classroom.
Now, they don't get grades like you would in a college class. They get these things called Don Rags.
Yeah, we have an unusual assessment system. In fact, students do get grades. And so, in fact, you can go to the registrar's office anytime and get a transcript that will look like a traditional transcript with grades on it. But our system doesn't give students their grades unless they proactively go and ask for them. And the reason for that is because we don't really want to emphasize the grades themselves. We want to emphasize the student's own education and development. And so instead, we do these Don Rags where at least once a year, sometimes once a semester, students will actually sit down with their tutors across all their different classes, and their tutors will talk about their performance. And in fact, they'll talk amongst each other. You will have an opportunity for the student themselves to ask questions too. But it's a real kind of iterative process of learning directly from your tutors about how you have been performing. That's performance in terms of your participation in the classroom, performance in terms of essays that you've written, occasional tests we take, although we're not a very test-heavy place. Almost all of the assessment are essays and class participation. And students emerge on the other side of these Don Rags, often feeling very proud about themselves, but also actually having substantive things to think about and to consider for the following semester as they try to grow as a student. And in a way that I think you don't get just from seeing an A or a B or a C on a particular transcript.
Could personality differences, relate to Don Rags? I mean, you're going to get along with some people better than others in a classroom.
And I think that's one of the reasons to have a kind of committee of tutors. And so you are being, assessed in a Don Rag by the whole group of tutors you've had over the course of a semester. And so, of course, you can have a stronger experience with one tutor than another, but all of them get to speak with each other. And often you find, there may be patterns across these classes. This is something you rarely find at a typical college that does kind of typical kinds of assessments. But in fact, the tutors can realize, in fact, some of the strengths or weaknesses that you've had in their class are manifesting themselves in other classes. And so it's an opportunity to reflect on that. Or it might be an opportunity to realize, in fact, there were differences perhaps with a tutor or with a subject matter that were really specific to a particular moment and is not true across many different.
Who succeeds in this kind of educational setting?
I think it's actually a really broad group of students who do. We're self-selecting in the sense that I think some students have a very particular notion in mind of what they want out of college. They might want a larger place. They might want big sports teams. They might want a major in a particular subject. But in fact, what St. John's does is so universally applicable. We are a place where students study every subject. They get to actually talk with people who are excited for these subjects. They get to kind of immerse themselves so deeply in, I think, what the point of college is all about, which is ideas. And so, you know, we have students who are drawn to us because they love literature and philosophy, and they see a lot of literature and philosophy in what we do. They hear great books. They think that's the right fit, and those students can thrive. But we have students who are interested in math and science, but who want to approach, you know, theory. They really want to get at the heart of what math and science is all about, not just memorize equations. And so they're drawn to St. John's. And so if there's one kind of unifying characteristic that I think you need to have a Johnny, to be a good Johnny, is a real love for ideas and that kind of intellectual passion. We often attract students who in their high schools are readily identifiable by their counselors and teachers because they're the student who refused to just do their assignments in class. They were always reading something extra, or they were even breaking the rules and they weren't reading what they were supposed to be reading in class because they were too busy reading philosophy on the side. And those are the students who really thrive when they get to, you know, our place.
Yeah, like I said, I can imagine it's very difficult to find these people in a lot of settings. And do you does St. John's get affected by the way curriculums have changed in public schools? Because now there's all these things about testing in the public school systems and what is essential to learn. Like you hear about schools dropping art and music, you know, to try to teach the nuts and bolts to get people out of high school. Is your school hurt by that in any way?
I don't think in any fundamental way, but there's certainly it's probably changed the way we even need to teach over the course of, you know, the decades. And this might be a question that's better asked of, I know, one of our tutors actually in the classroom, but we have students who come with different levels of experience in music now. I mean, that's an obvious one. All of our students study music freshman and sophomore year, and we are prepared for students who have absolutely no background in music, and we are prepared for students who have really rich backgrounds in music. But I won't be surprised to hear that over the years, we've seen a decline in people coming with that musical experience. We have students who have studied foreign languages for many years. And as I mentioned earlier, all of our students freshman year study ancient Greek. That's pretty unusual. Not many students come having studied ancient Greek in the past. We don't expect them to have, but we hope they've studied a foreign language so they know what that process of learning a new language is all about. The same could be true of math as well, where students are coming with varying levels of math. We really feel that, you know, having Algebra 2 is pretty essential to our starting point in where we approach math. You know, but the more students who come with a background in calculus, the stronger math experience they can really have. So some of these things I'm sure have changed over time, but I think we're also very accommodating of students who are starting in different places in many different subjects and being able to kind of guide them together to the same finish point.
I mean, I could imagine like with you know, Euclidean geometry, you have geometry and calculus and you touch on these things. It's just, like I said, I could see kids who would really benefit from the education, and their knowledge base would be at a low level, all of a sudden be at a very high level as a result, but they don't walk in with that.
And I don't think they need to. I mean, when we were developed this curriculum in 1937, a lot of the language about the founders of this program was about how this was an education for all people. It wasn't meant to be an elite education that was only for some small subset of people. The thought was, we are studying the things that make the world what it is today. These are fundamental across all these different subject areas. And we want people of all stripes to come and immerse themselves in this and learn about themselves actually through this curriculum. And so there are some some preparation that is really necessary to jump into such a vigorous program. There's no doubt about that. But we don't want to set the bar so high that we're excluding people who can really develop in some amazing ways over the course of 4 years at St. John's, just because they were a little behind in music or a little behind in math in their high school experience.
Since 1937, has St. John's been co-ed?
We went co-ed in the 1950s, I believe 1951. So earlier than some schools, but in those early years, we're all men.
And the physical campus is pretty much the way it was back then?
Pretty much. There have been new buildings, some new academic buildings constructed in the late 1950s, but the bulk of the Annapolis campus looks the way it did in the 19th century, in fact. And so we have these beautiful buildings, the majority of them 19th century, but actually some 18th century. The main academic building on campus, McDowell Hall, was built to be the colonial governors of Maryland's home. So really beautiful colonial American architecture on the Annapolis campus. And when you go to the Santa Fe campus, while it's a more recently constructed, it follows really the style and history of Santa Fe. And so our buildings are Adobe style, are really right on the mountains, and all of our dorms and classrooms in Santa Fe have balconies. And so the idea is that the indoor spaces and the outdoor spaces blend together. And so you're experiencing the mountains of New Mexico in a way that really they were intended to be experienced. The curriculum is the same on these two campuses, or virtually identical, but the experience of being in Annapolis or being in Santa Fe can be quite different.
Is this curriculum easy to adapt to Zoom?
It is a challenge to adapt to Zoom, but in some ways, I think actually we're able to do it better than many other curricula that aren't suited to this. I mean, the essence of what we do are a small classroom having a discussion about a book. And so, you can be in a Zoom grid with 18 faces and actually have a genuine conversation. We don't have any lectures. We don't have any pre-recorded content. We require our students to have their faces on the screen so they can see each other and have a conversation. And so in that sense, while all of our students and our faculty really wish we could be back in person fully at this moment, I think we've had a genuine success doing this online. And it's one of the things I think it's been kind of most proud of our community over the last few months is our ability to really sustain ourselves to do the core of what St. John's is all about, having these really profound conversations about books, and yet doing it in this very, to us, somewhat unnatural way, but doing it so successfully.
How, are students back on campus now?
We have a majority of our students back on campus. They came back in early February. We were able to put in place a whole regimen of procedures to make both of our campuses safe, including weekly testing, single dorm rooms, compulsory mask compliance, social distancing measures. The classes for right now are mostly online, even though students are on campus. But in fact, we're going to gradually transition to more hybrid classes over time as the situation becomes better. And those hybrid classes can include socially distant spaces, indoors. We also have set up tents on our campuses so there can be outdoor classes. At the moment, we have a mix. We have students who are living on campus. We have students who are living off campus. And students will do a combination of classes that are hybrid or fully online.
And is a senior, your smallest class will still be something like 15 or 18?
Yes, and so there's no class larger than 20. That's kind of the hard cap we've placed on things. And on a typical class can range from, maybe on the small end from about 14 students to an average that's really right around 16, 17 students.
St. John's, from what I read before we talked, has done a lot to make this affordable. Can you walk me through some of that?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing we did is 2 years ago, we announced we were, in fact, cutting our tuition and reducing what had been a tuition of over $52,000 to $35,000. So a rather substantial change. And this emerged really at first from conversations with our own alumni. We were talking with our own alumni community, and we were hearing over and over again that St. John's wasn't affordable for their own children, which was incredibly disturbing, and also, in fact, not entirely true. In many cases, for decades, we've been giving out lots of both need-based financial aid and merit scholarships. And yet people would just see that price tag of over $52,000 and thinks St. John's was just not affordable for their families. And so this conversation started with our alumni, and we did a lot of research. And we started two things at the same time. We reduced our tuition to the $35,000, and we began a capital campaign built around fundraising to make St. John's affordable, to pay for that reduction in tuition. And so that $300 million capital campaign, we're now a few years into it. In fact, we have over $200 million raised. So we're well on our way. But reducing our tuition to $35,000, where it has stayed since 2018, so in fact, it is still at that $35,000, was one key component of this. But the other key components have been continuing to offer as much need-based financial aid as we possibly can. This past year, we implemented a new matching grant for Pell Grants. And so any student at St. John's who's receiving a Pell Grant will now receive a matching grant that goes along with it, that comes from the college. And then also continuing to make the college affordable through the use of merit scholarships. And so we have merit scholarships that can range from, very small amounts to many that might be around $15,000 to a very small number that are in fact full tuition scholarships. But these enable us to enroll a genuinely diverse class, people of all different backgrounds, all different places, and it includes our international students. And so it's one way we've kept a very diverse international student community as well.
Has that increased the number of interested applicants?
It has. We saw a jump in our applications in the years following that tuition change. This year, in fact, we have the largest number of applications we've ever had before. And we're a place that, as we noted earlier, has been test optional for a long time. And so these jumps that we've heard about at lots of other colleges and applications, because they've gone test optional, that's not the case at St. John's. I'd like to believe that, in fact, are talking about affordability more openly, are being true to ourselves and what this curriculum is all about, that getting that message out there has really increased the size of our applicant pool.
Does anything in the application process lead students to self-select, like essays they have to write or documents you ask them to produce, like a graded paper or something like that?
Yeah, and in terms of what we ask for in the application process, we look like many other colleges. The one exception to that is that we have a supplemental essay where, of course, we ask students to tell us about a book that they love and how it's influenced their life in some way. And so that book essay is the one really St. John's specific piece to the application. But how we assess the applications is actually quite different from what you find at many other colleges. We have admissions officers who read applications, but in fact, our faculty also read all of the applications. And we put greater weight on that book essay than anything else that's submitted to us. We are searching for those students who are the right fit. And that isn't something you necessarily see from a high school transcript, or certainly not test scores. You may find it through recommendations, but it can vary a lot depending upon the high school they're from. And so that essay about a book is often the best place for getting evidence of fit for St. John's. And we'll take students who we take a risk on. Perhaps their transcript isn't the strongest transcript in their high school, but in fact, we see the makings of a real Johnny through their essay, through their letters of recommendation, and so we'll admit them. And conversely, there are students we see who are perfectly fine students. They might succeed at lots of other colleges, but they aren't a fit for us, and we can see that because of their essays, or maybe what's talked about in the recommendations as well.
Do you think that, are there occasions where an applicant tries too hard? Like they pick one of the great books and you can kind of tell they didn't read it?
Yeah, all the time. But I think we also have to remind ourselves that for the most part, we're talking about 17, 18, 19-year-olds. This is an extraordinarily stressful process. And so I take, these essays with a grain of salt. I often have to really read between the lines. I mean, sometimes I'm given everything I could possibly want in an essay from a student, and I love it when they do that, and the fit is evident. But frequently I have to sit there and think, this isn't the essay I would have hoped to see from this student, but I'm hearing things in perhaps a few lines of their essay, in a few lines of their recommendations, in the extracurricular activities they participate in, that these things, when I knit this together, I'm hearing a story of a student who maybe doesn't quite have it all together yet, but who will have it together, who will thrive as a Johnny. And I think of that as part of my job in this holistic admissions process. It's not just to, to find the right fits and to weed out everyone else. It's to advocate for students, and it's to really find those students who will thrive, even if all of the evidence isn't, put on a silver platter in front of me.
Last question. Obviously, this is everybody's going through the same education, but they don't intend to all have the same outcome. What happens when someone wants to go to medical school and or be a nurse or be a teacher or something where you had to take skills courses of some kind to be ready to come? How do you help how does St. John's help establish a bridge between the undergrad degree and the next place they're going to go?
Yeah, and our students do just about everything. I mean, like any other liberal arts college with lots of majors, I mean, we have lots of subjects our students are studying, and so they find themselves in all sorts of different careers. If there's one kind of uniting characteristic, it's that as a kind of intellectual place where students love books and ideas, we tend to send them on to careers and graduate schools that continue that. And so we create a lot of teachers at St. John's, a lot of lawyers, a lot of journalists and writers. We send the vast majority of our students on to graduate school, if not immediately, but eventually. We're one of the top producers of PhDs in the country. And so that's the curriculum itself that helps encourage those kinds of things. But part of the advantage to being such a small college is the personalized attention that students can get. And so our career services offices on both campuses allow students to meet with them as early as their freshman year, to have one-on-one conversations with the director of career services, to help them work on their resumes, to practice their interview skills. We bring employers to campus for career fairs. We have alumni who are volunteering to have students shadow them. We have a great internship program that not only helps students find internships, but provides funding for them over the summers so that they can do what otherwise would be unpaid internships. So these are all some of the ways our students are finding these careers. But I think part of the point of St. John's is this 4-year transformative experience where students might come in with an idea of what they want to do after 4 years, and occasionally they pursue that, but more often they're transformed by the classes they're taking, by the ideas they're debating, and they end up doing something they might not have expected when they first entered. And that is, I think, part of the point of college.
Ben, that's the perfect way to end this interview. This is one of these schools where you can learn literally everything if you put your heart and your head to it. But you have to be prepared to work, and you have to be prepared to read, and you have to be open to things that you never learned before. Ben, thank you for spending this afternoon with me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.